AI's $500 million problem, why more compute does not mean more productivity. Amazon reportedly spent around $500 million on Claude. $500 million. Imagine being the CFO who receives that bill. At some point, someone walks into your office and says, "Good news, everybody's using AI." And your response? Great. What did we get for that $500 million? That's the question suddenly appearing all over. For the last 2 years, AI spending has largely been measured in adoption. How many employees have access? How many prompts were generated? How many coding assistants are active? How many tokens are consumed? But as the bills get larger, executives are being forced to ask, how much value was actually created? I think the story connects to three much larger ideas. First, companies are discovering that AI usage is not the same thing as AI value. Second, compute is becoming a foundational economic resource, much like electricity was a century ago. And third, many of the people being disrupted by AI don't own the compute that's replacing parts of their work. When you put these three ideas together, I think you get a much clearer idea of what is actually happening in AI and in the economy. Let's get into it. Idea one, usage is not value. One of the strangest things about the AI boom is we've often treated usage as if it were a success. If employees generated 1,000 summaries, that was a success. If 1 million lines of code were written by AI, that was a success. If token usage doubled, that was a success. But these aren't business outcomes. These are activity metrics. Imagine a company announcing, "We've doubled the number of emails sent by our employees in this year." Nobody would celebrate that. Because sending emails isn't the goal. Creating value is the goal. Yet, for much of the AI boom, we've confused consumption with productivity. Companies bought enterprise licenses. Employees are encouraged to use AI for everything. Every presentation, every meeting summary, every spreadsheet, every piece of code. A bunch of startups came up off the back of that. And because the technology felt revolutionary, many organizations assumed the ROI would eventually appear. Now the bills are arriving, and the CFOs are asking the obvious question. What did all of that activity actually create in terms of economic value? That's not an AI failure particularly. It is, however, definitely a measurement failure, and clearly there's a bunch of more generic failures happening here. Idea two, compute is the new electricity. People often say AI is the new electricity, and I think they're right. However, the common interpretation is everyone will eventually use AI just as everyone eventually used electricity. This is true, but the important part is what happened after electrification. The factories that won weren't the factories that consumed the most electricity. The factories that won were the ones that reorganized production around electricity. Before electrification, manufacturing relied heavily on skilled labor, manual processes, and small workshops. After electrification came assembly lines, mass production, standardization, entirely new organizational structures. The breakthrough wasn't electricity itself. The breakthrough was learning how to organize work around a new source of power. And that's where I think we are with AI. Compute is becoming a foundational economic input, just like electricity, just like fuel, just like bandwidth. And many organizations are still treating it as a novelty. They're plugging AI into existing workflows and hoping productivity magically appears. They're also hoping ROI magically appears. That's the equivalent of discovering electricity and then leaving every machine running 24 hours a day because electricity feels exciting. Which brings us back to the Amazon story. If compute is the new electricity, then tokenmaxxing is the equivalent of turning every light on in a skyscraper 24 hours a day and calling it innovation. Consumption is not strategy. Allocation is strategy. And that's where the third idea comes in. Idea three. People being disrupted don't own the compute. Over the last year, I've written several articles about translators and AI. These articles generated a surprising amount of discussion, not because of technology, but because of the economics. One translator left a comment that I haven't stopped thinking about. She wrote, "Everyone says AI will allow translators to focus on higher order work. No one explains who's going to pay for that higher order work." It's a powerful question, because when people talk about AI disruption, they often assume workers can simply move up the value chain, become supervisors, become reviewers, become strategists. But supervision isn't automatically a business model. And this is where the electricity analogy becomes useful again. Think about what happened during industrialization. The village blacksmith became poor because the village blacksmith didn't own the steel mill. The productive asset changed. The ownership changed with it. And I think something similar is happening today. The productive asset is increasingly compute. Knowledge workers don't own it. The value is moving towards people who own the models, the infrastructure, the distribution, and the compute. Translation just happens to be one of the first professions experiencing this transition in a visible way. But it's not the last. Putting the pieces together. So what happens when we combine these three ideas? Companies discover that AI usage is not the same thing as AI value. They discover that compute is becoming a core economic resource. And knowledge workers discover that many of the tasks they used to sell can now be partially performed by compute. That's the transition we're living through. And I think people are misunderstanding what happens next. The future doesn't belong to people who use the most AI. The future belongs to people who learn how to allocate AI. Become a compute allocator. Let's go back to translators. A translator who simply sells translated documents is increasingly competing against cheap compute. A translator who manages multilingual localization across 20 countries is doing something different. They're allocating compute. A translator who builds AI-assisted translation workflows is allocating compute. A translator who runs quality assurance processes across languages is allocating compute. Notice what's happening. The translator isn't disappearing, but the work of the translator is changing fundamentally. The challenge is to get from where we are now to a structure that supports translators without a whole heap of economic pain in the middle. And I don't know if we can do that, but that's the challenge. The end outcome will be where translators are closer to deciding where should compute be used, how much compute should be used, where does quality matter, where does culture matter. Think allocation decisions that embed an underlying layer of compute. That's where we think the industry is going to go. I think the same thing is going to happen across almost every knowledge profession. Future marketers will allocate compute. Future lawyers will allocate compute. The future accountants will allocate compute. I would say future software engineers would allocate compute, but that's what they're already doing. The scarce skill isn't producing the outputs. It's knowing how human judgment and machine capability should be combined to create value. That's a much harder skill. Ultimately, that may well be the more valuable skill. When I see stories about giant AI bills, companies reducing AI budgets, I don't think we're watching the AI bubble burst. That might happen in the financial markets, but from a technical perspective, I think we're looking at the end of the AI abundance era. The first phase of AI was about access. The second phase is all about efficiency. The first phase is about consuming compute. The second phase will be about allocating compute. A century ago, electricity transformed the economy. But the winners weren't the people who consumed the most electricity. They were the people who learned to organize production around it. The same thing is happening today. The question isn't who has access to AI. The question is who knows how to turn compute into economic value. And that might end up being the most important skill of the next decade. Thanks so much.